Albania has a total area of 28,748 square kilometers. It shares a 186 kilometers border with Montenegro to the northwest, a 112 kilometers border with Kosovo to the northeast, a 181 kilometers border with Macedonia to the north and east, and a 212 kilometers border with Greece to the south and southeast. Albania's coastline length on the Adriatic Sea and the Ionian Sea is 476 kilometers. The lowlands of the west face the Adriatic Sea in the strategically important Strait of Otranto, which puts less than 72 kilometers of water between Albania and the heel of the Italian boot borders. With the exception of the coastline, all Albanian borders are artificial. They were established in principle at the 1912–1913 Conference of Ambassadors in London. The country was occupied by Italian, Serbian, Bulgarian, Austro-Hungarian, Greek, and French forces during World War I, but the 1913 boundaries were essentially reaffirmed by the victorious states in 1921. Division of the Lake District among three states required that each of them have a share of the lowlands in the vicinity. Such an artificial distribution, once made, necessarily affected the borderlines to the north and south. The border that runs generally north from the lakes, although it follows the ridges of the eastern highlands, stays 16 to 32 kilometers west of the watershed divide, because negotiators at the London Conference declined to use the watershed divide as the northeast boundary of the new state of Albania. The Albanian population of Kosovo was incorporated into Serbia. In Albania's far north and the northeast mountainous sections, the border connects high points and follows mountain ridges through the largely inaccessible Prokletija, and further south Bjeshkeci Namuna. For the most part, there is no natural boundary from the highlands to the Adriatic, although Lake Shkoda and a portion of the Buna River south of it were used to mark Albania's northwest border. For the Lake District south and southwest to the Ionian Sea, the country's southeast border goes against the grain of the land, crossing a number of ridges instead of following them. There are four main geographical regions in Albania: the northern mountain range, the southern mountain range, the western lowlands, and the central mountain range. Climate. See also Climate of Albania, with its coastline facing the Adriatic and Ionian Seas, its highlands backed upon the elevated Balkan land mass, and the entire country lying at a latitude subject to a variety of weather patterns during the winter and summer seasons. Albania has a high number of climatic regions for so small an area. The coastal lowlands have typically Mediterranean weather. The highlands have a Mediterranean continental climate. In both the lowlands and the interior, the weather varies markedly from north to south. The lowlands have mild winters, averaging about 7 degrees Celsius. Summer temperatures average 32 degrees Celsius. Humidity is low. In the southern lowlands, temperatures average about 5 degrees Celsius in the winter and 30 degrees Celsius during the summer. Inland temperatures are affected more by differences in elevation than by latitude or any other factor. Low winter temperatures in the mountains are caused by the continental air mass that dominates the weather in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Northerly and northeasterly winds blow much of the time. Average summer temperatures are lower than in the coastal areas and much lower at higher elevations, but daily fluctuations are greater. Daytime maximum temperatures in the interior basins and river valleys are very high, but the nights are almost almost always cool. Average precipitation is heavy, a result of the convergence of the prevailing airflow from the Mediterranean Sea in the continental air mass, because they usually meet at the point where the terrain rises. The heaviest rain falls in the central uplands. Vertical currents initiated when the Mediterranean air is uplifted also cause frequent thunderstorms. Many of these storms are accompanied by high local winds and torrential downpours. When the continental air mass is weak, Mediterranean winds drop the moisture farther inland. When there is a dominant continental air mass, cold air spills onto the lowland areas, which occurs most frequently in the winter. Because the season's lower temperatures damage olive trees and citrus fruits, groves and orchards are restricted to sheltered places with southern and western exposures, even in areas with high average winter temperature. Lowland rainfall averages from 1,000 mm to more than 1,500 mm annually, with the higher levels in the north. Nearly 95% of the rain falls in the winter. Rainfall in the upland mountain ranges is heavier. Adequate records are not available, and estimates vary widely, but annual averages are probably about 1,800 mm and are as high as 2,550 mm in some northern areas. The seasonal variation is not quite as great in the coastal area. The higher inland mountains receive less precipitation than the intermediate uplands. Terrain differences cause wide local variations, but the seasonal distribution is the most consistent of any area. Terrain. The 70% of the country that is mountainous is rugged. The remainder, an alluvial plain, receives precipitation seasonally, is poorly drained, and is alternately arid or flooded. Much of the plain's soil is of poor quality, far from offering a relief from the difficult interior terrain. The alluvial plain is often as inhospitable as the mountains. Good soil and dependable precipitation, however, are found in intermontane river basins, in the Lake District along the eastern frontier, and in a narrow band of slightly elevated land between the coastal plains and the interior mountains. In the far north, the mountains are an extension of the Dinaric Alps and, more specifically, the Montenegrin limestone plateau. Albania's northern mountains are more folded and rugged, however, than most of the plateau. The rivers have deep valleys with steep sides and arable valley floors. Generally unnavigable, the rivers obstruct rather than encourage movement within the alpine region. Roads are few and poor, lacking internal communications and external contacts. A tribal society flourished in this area for centuries. Only after World War II were serious efforts made to incorporate the people of the region into Albanian national life. A low coastal belt extends from the northern boundary southward to the vicinity of Vlora. On average, it extends less than 16 kilometers inland, but widens to about 50 kilometers in the Elbasan area in central Albania. In its natural state, the coastal belt is characterized by low scrub vegetation, varying from barren to dense. There are large areas of marshlands and other areas of bare, eroded badlands, where elevations rise slightly and precipitation is regular. In the foothills of the central uplands, for example, the land is highly arable. Marginal land is reclaimed wherever irrigation is possible. Just east of the lowlands, the central uplands, called Sermanite by Albanians, are an area of generally moderate elevations between 305 and 915 meters, with a few points reaching above 1,520 meters. Shifting along the fault that roughly defines the western edge of the central uplands causes frequent, and occasionally severe earthquakes. Although rugged terrain and points of high elevation mark the central uplands, the first major mountain range inland from the Adriatic is an area of predominantly serpentine rock, extending nearly the length of the country, for the Procliteu to the Greek border south of course. Within this zone, there are many areas in which sharp limestone and sandstone outcroppings predominate, although the ranges as a whole are characterized by rounded mountains. The mountains east of the Serpentine zone have the highest in Albania, exceeding 2,754 meters in the Mount Korab range at Korab's peak, together with the Procliteu and the Serpentine zone. The eastern highlands are the most rugged and inaccessible of any terrain on the Balkan Peninsula. The three lakes of easternmost Albania, Lake Ohrid, Big Prespa Lake, and Small Prespa Lake, are remote and picturesque. Much of the terrain in the vicinity is not overly steep, and it supports a larger population than any other inland portion of the country. Albania's eastern border passes through Lake Ohrid, all but a small tip of Prespa Vogel is in Greece, and the point at which the boundaries of three states meet is in Lake Prespa. Each of the two larger lakes has a total surface areas of about 260 square kilometers, and Prespa Vogel is about one-fifth as large. The surface elevation is about 695 meters for Lake Ohrid and 855 meters for the other two lakes. The southern mountain ranges are more accessible than the Serpentine zone, the eastern highlands, or the Procliteu. The transition to the lowlands is less abrupt, and the arable valley floors are wider. Limestone, the predominant mineral, is responsible for the cliffs and clear water of the coastline southeast of Vlora. Erosion of a blend of softer rocks has provided the sediment that has caused wider valleys to form in the southern mountain area than those characteristic of the remainder of the country. This terrain encouraged the development of larger landholding, thus influencing the social structure of southern Albania. Drainage. Nearly all of the precipitation that falls on Albania drains into the rivers and reaches the coast without even leaving the country. In the north, only one small stream escapes Albania. In the south, an even smaller rivulet drains into Greece, because the topographical divide is east of the Albanian border with its neighbors. A considerable amount of water from other countries drains through Albania. An extensive portion of the basin of the White Dran River basin is in the Rashii Dukagjinet area, across Albania's northeastern border. The three eastern lakes that Albania shares with its neighboring countries, as well as the streams that flow into them, drain into the Black Dran River. The watershed divide in the south also dips nearly 75 kilometers into Greece at one point. Several tributaries of the Vjosa River rise in that area, with the exception of the Black Dran, which flows northward and drains nearly the entire eastern border region before it turns westward to the sea. Most of the rivers in northern and central Albania flow fairly directly westward to the sea. In the process, they cut through the ridges rather than flow around them. This apparent geological impossibility occurs because the highlands originally were lifted without much folding. The streams came into existence at the time. The compression and folding of the plateau into ridges occurred later. The folding process was rapid enough in many instances to dam the rivers temporarily. The resulting lakes existed until their downstream channels became wide enough to drain them. This sequence created the many interior basins that are typically a part of the Albanian landform. During the lifetime of the temporary lakes, enough sediment was deposited in them to form the basis for fertile soils. Folding was rarely rapid enough to force the streams into radically different channels. The precipitous fall from higher elevations and the highly irregular seasonal flow patterns that are characteristic of nearly all streams in the country reduce the economic value of the streams. They erode the mountains and deposit the sediment that created the lowlands and continues to augment them. But the rivers flood when there is local rainfall. When the lands are parched and need irrigation, the rivers usually are dry. The violence when they are full makes them difficult to control, and they are unnavigable. The Buna River is an exception. It is stretched between Shkoda River and the Adriatic Sea and can be navigated by small ships. In contrast to the history of holding fast to the courses in the mountains, the rivers constantly change channels on the lower plains, making waste of much of the land they create. The Dran River is the largest and most constant stream, fed by melting snows from the northern and eastern mountains and by the more evenly distributed seasonal precipitation of that area. Its flow does not have the extreme variations characteristic of nearly all other rivers in the country. Its normal flow varies seasonally by only about one-third. Along its length of about 282 kilometers, it drains nearly 5,957 square kilometers within Albania, as it also collects from the Adriatic portion of Kosovo's watersheds and the three border lakes. Its total basin encompasses about 15,540 square kilometers. The Samani and Vjosa are the only other rivers that are more than 160 kilometers long and have basins larger than 2,600 square kilometers. These rivers drain the southern regions and, reflecting the seasonal distribution of rainfall, are torrents in winter and nearly dry in the summer. In spite of the length, this variable nature also characterizes the many shorter streams. In the summer, most of them carry less than a tenth of the winter averages, if they are not altogether dry. Although the sediment carried by the mountain torrents continues to be deposited, new deposits delay exploitation. Stream channels rise as silt is deposited in them and eventually become higher than the surrounding terrain. Shifting channels frustrate development in many areas. Old channels become barriers to proper drainage and create swamps or marshlands. It is difficult to build roads or railroads across the lowlands or otherwise use the land. Extreme points: latitude and longitude: north, Malesi Made, south, Sarand, west, Sazan Island, Vlora mainland, Vlora, East, Devil District. Elevation maximum: Korab Peak, Mount Korab, 2,764 meters. Minimum: Adriatic Sea, 0 meters.